Crowds of desperate Afghans gather at the airport, rushing onto the tarmac, hoping to escape the country. While so far the Islamists show clemency to those opposing them for now. Thousands of Afghans have been rushing to Kabul's international airport, hoping to leave Afghanistan following the Taliban's takeover of the country. US troops are guarding the airport's perimeter and fired warning shots to control the situation. While the airport is currently closed to civilian air traffic, foreign diplomats and their families are gathering there in preparation for an airlift out of the country. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani has fled to neighboring Uzbekistan, and Taliban fighters are now taking up strategic positions in the capital.
Kabul awakes to a new era. Almost 2 decades after they were ousted from the Afghan capital, Taliban fighters roam the heavily fortified Green Zone, the seat of government buildings, embassies, and NATO's Afghan mission. The insurgents virtually alone on the deserted streets as residents remained holed up in their homes, hiding. The tense morning calm, a sharp contrast to the chaos that erupted as the government collapsed. As fear and confusion spread, thousands rushed to Kabul Airport. But commercial flights were soon cancelled, leaving some fighting for seats and most with no way to escape the country. The Taliban appeared before the press from the presidential palace and declared the war over. News soon came that President Ashraf Ghani had fled the country. One of his predecessors released a video pledging to remain. Hamid Karzai later announced he would form a coordinating council with other officials to manage a peaceful transfer of power. As protesters in Washington accused President Biden of abandoning Afghanistan, the U.S. joined some 60 countries in calling for the immediate restoration of security and civil order. New Zealand's Prime Minister addressed Taliban leaders directly.
Allow people to leave safely, and secondly, demonstrate that you are going to be an administration that takes into account the well-being, for instance, of women and girls, the ability to be educated, all those things the international community have been calling on for some time, because the whole world will be watching.
Afghans face an uncertain future. The insurgents say they want a peaceful takeover. But reports of revenge killings and other crimes against humanity have followed them in the wake of their rapid offensive. Their promise of peace will mean little to the people they have terrorized for decades.
Well, journalist Franz Marti is in the Afghan capital, Kabul, and joins us now from there. Franz, the situation seems to be especially dramatic at the airports. We've seen the videos making the rounds on social media of people holding on to plane tires and falling off mid-air. What can you tell us?
Indeed, since yesterday, there have been thousands of people going to the airport hoping to get a plane ride out, some without passport or without ticket, without any realistic hope to get a plane, even if one would start. Then they breach part of the airport facility, even moved to the runway, which led to these chaotic scenes. And as you rightly mentioned, apparently at least 1 or 2 people clung to planes, and when they took off and were airborne, fell down to their death. That is, of course, very tragic, but it should also be noted that these were like a few exceptions and not that this happens with every flight. It should also be noted that the chaos at the airport contrasts with the situation in other parts of the city where it is pretty quiet. The Taliban have brought in more people and have deployed Taliban in various parts of town, but there it is usually like quiet, with few civilians on the street, people waiting in houses to see what comes, with no shooting, no chaos, no fighting on the streets. So a stark contrast, the calm streets in the city with the chaos at the airport.
Well, you mentioned people sort of waiting in their houses. What do Afghans in general expect now from a Taliban government?
This is hard to say. I mean, the ones that flee, they certainly expect nothing. They're just afraid of harsh Taliban rule and try everything to get out. The one that remain, there's also a wide spectrum. Some people are more or less resigned and don't expect much and are just waiting to see what the Taliban will announce. and trying to get as little involved as possible. And others, of course, have hope that, for example, at least the violence stops that has plagued Afghanistan during the past years. But then people are certainly also concerned what this will mean in Taliban areas that have been earlier conquered. People have several times told me, for example, that one of the greatest fears is that the new Taliban rule can lead to like an economic collapse and like even worse unemployment than already existed during the past few years in Afghanistan.
Talking about the economy there, the Taliban will need to be able to form an administration of some sort. I mean, their fighters are not necessarily good civil servants. Do they have enough people to organize the administration of the country?
They themselves probably not, but they have already in provinces that they overrun, they have time and time again called on government officials, lower ranking civil servants to like resume work after they take over an area. Because they don't have the manpower, they don't have the skills to run like government authorities. So what they try is to co-opt like people from the current government to continue their work. This, of course, doesn't include like high-ranking officials because the Taliban have made pretty clear that on the top it will be their people who are calling the shots.
So far, the Taliban have shown some clemency towards both government soldiers and, as you mentioned, government officials in the lower ranks. They say they do not plan to take revenge on those who've opposed them. How credible is this, and may that change?
In the past days and past weeks, they have indeed shown clemency. They seem to have been part of an orchestrated effort to like show the people of Afghanistan, especially government forces, kind of you don't have to worry when we take over. We won't harm you. So what's the point in continuing fighting if you can like surrender and you have nothing to worry? And that this is not only propaganda was confirmed to me by several government officials who have like surrendered in the past days, past weeks, that they were rather surprised how well they were treated by the Taliban. That doesn't mean that there haven't been exceptions. There have been especially well-documented cases of revenge killings in Spin Boldak at the border in southern Kandahar province or in Malistan towards the central highlands in the province of Ghazni. How this will continue is an open question because once the Taliban now consolidate their grip on power, they might not have any more the need to show that much clemency, and they might become harsher. At this point, this is speculation, though, and only time can tell.
Franz Marti there in Kabul. Thank you, Franz. Let's get a different angle now. Bring in Shamil Shams. He's with DW's Asia desk and joins us from Bonn. Shamil, how do people in Afghanistan feel about the way the US and other nations have rapidly withdrawn their troops now from their country?
Well, we have to understand that the Taliban have supporters not only in Kabul, but in parts of Afghanistan as well. So many of them are euphoric, very happy about the Taliban takeover of the capital. But the liberal Afghans, mostly who are residing in Kabul, feel abandoned and betrayed. They feel that the US left them at the mercy of the Taliban, and with all US promises about democracy, institution building, and secularism, women's rights, it's now pretty much down the drain. So they feel angry, frustrated, and the people we spoke to for our coverage for the Asia desk extremely unhappy about the situation, not only in Afghanistan, but in the regional countries like Pakistan, Iran. They all feel shocked and devastated.
You talked about the regional neighbors there, but do the Taliban have international backers? Who supports them financially and or politically?
We know that Pakistan has been supporting the Taliban for decades. In 1996, when the Taliban took over Kabul, captured Kabul, Pakistan not only supported The Taliban, they are one of the first countries who recognized the regime, along with Saudi Arabia. So Pakistan will continue to back the Taliban as far as I know and what I see. And Russia and China are also kind of, in a way, happy about the situation that the US troops, NATO troops have left the Afghanistan. They see an opportunity for their geostrategic aims and objectives in Afghanistan. So Pakistan, China, and Russia probably, most likely, will be backing any potential Taliban government in Kabul.
Now, the Taliban have talked about forming an inclusive government. Are the Taliban a group that other groups or people can have a true dialogue with?
Who would they have a dialogue with? President Ghani fled the country. Now the Taliban have an upper hand. They are practically now in control of Kabul and Afghanistan. So I don't see them initiating a dialogue with other Afghan stakeholders, civil society, for instance, and other Afghan politicians, the member of parliaments. I don't see it happening because the Taliban now have an upper hand. US President Biden shows no interest in Afghanistan whatsoever, other than evacuating the Americans from Afghanistan. So the situation is pretty clear. The Taliban have all the power. They have all the cards. They're calling the shots now. I don't see that they would negotiate much with any other group in Afghanistan. But as they said, that they would like to have an inclusive government, and probably they would like to have an international recognition also. So in that way, we could have a semblance of dialogue and a semblance of like a broad-based government in Kabul. But I have my doubts about it.
Shamil Shams there from DW Asia. Thank you, Shamil.
Thanks very much.
Well, Germany has meanwhile closed its embassy in Kabul and is sending military transport planes to airlift embassy personnel and local staff from the airport there. The first of those planes was loaded this morning before it took off for Kabul, which has been closed to commercial traffic. A limited team of diplomats will remain at the airport to coordinate the final pullout. And for more on the German side of things, I'm now joined by Tom Wiegold. He's an independent defense analyst and expert on Germany's Bundeswehr. Tom, Germany's Air Force are now about to start airlifting personnel and local Afghan staff out of Kabul. What are you hearing? How is that operation going?
Well, actually, they might be running into problems. What I'm hearing is that they are en route to Kabul. However, the German Foreign Ministry spokesman said a few hours ago that the airport actually can't take any landings, any takeoffs at the moment because of the crowds on the tarmac. We've seen those pictures on social media where people were all over the airport clinging to the undercarriage of starting airplanes. So it's an utter mess at the airport, and nobody really knows if those planes who are in the air now can actually land in Kabul.
There's also a unit of special forces on these planes. Will they be able to protect the operation, or is Germany dependent on the goodwill of the Taliban to get its people out?
Well, actually, it's paratroopers, and it's a rather small group. We're talking about, let's say, 200 soldiers here. Actually, the securing the airport is partly or mostly the task of the US troops, a few thousand still on the ground. On the other hand, it's all depending on what the Taliban will do. However, they have no reason to do anything at the moment because, as I said, it's so chaotic that flight operations might not work without a single shot fired, without the Taliban doing anything. And if those evacuations can work at all, we'll see.
So assuming that the planes will at some stage be able to land, let's talk about not only German officials, but also the local staff, the interpreters, drivers, cooks that have been working for the Bundeswehr there. How many people are we talking about to be airlifted out, and how determined is Germany to get them out?
Well, that depends whom you're asking. The formal number is a few hundred, up to maybe 2,000. those who have been supporting the German armed forces when they were deployed to Afghanistan. However, all those people are not at the airport at the moment. Most of them are hiding in safe houses somewhere in Kabul. Quite a lot is somewhere in the countryside in Mazar-i-Sharif, where the Germans were based. So even if Germany would be or is willing to take them all out, there are no means to do so. Those soldiers, they have no means to leave the airport, to go anywhere. The US has helicopters. The Germans didn't bring or won't bring any helicopters. So regardless, whatever figure we hear, it's not very realistic that they will be taken out.
Tom, Germany had boots on the ground there for 20 years, mainly training the Afghan military. And you've been there yourself with German troops while they were deployed. I mean, if we're looking at the quick surrender of the Afghan army now, I can't help but asking, what do you think the Bundeswehr taught them?
Well, I've talked to a lot of Bundeswehr soldiers in recent days, and they are all very frustrated and disappointed. Some, however, tell me, well, it's not that much of a surprise because it wasn't that easy or that successful to train, especially the lower ranks. Many of the normal soldiers choose being a soldier for the salary, not because they wanted to be soldiers. So it's a mix. When we're talking about the higher ranks, I think there's even more disappointment. In recent years, German generals, colonels have been advising their Afghan counterparts, and those counterparts obviously didn't deliver any resistance to the Taliban, and they are asking themselves what went wrong, what did we do wrong. And it's not about the training as such, it's about the morale, it's about the will to fight, and that seems to be lacking.
Tom Wiegel, the independent defense analyst. Thank you very much, Tom.
You're welcome.
The international community was stunned by the Taliban's fast progress. A spokesman for the foreign ministry here in Berlin has now admitted that the German government and its allies failed to properly assess the security situation in Afghanistan.
It is right, and there's nothing to sugarcoat. Our assessment of how the situation would develop, which was not only the assessment of the German government, but a coordinated assessment with the partners, was wrong.
Let's bring in our chief political correspondent, Melinda Crane, on this. Melinda, pretty damning words there. What kind of political fallout are we likely to see here in Berlin?
Well, it's early days, but certainly at the moment we're seeing a massive criticism, terms like shameful, across-the-board disaster, chaotic, totally without a plan, terms that are coming from the opposition parties, but also even from some members of the CDU and the SPD, which are, of course, the partners in the governing coalition. So one thing is for certain, NGOs have long been calling for a thoroughgoing review of the Afghanistan mission and its failures, and it seems more likely now than ever that we will eventually see such a review, though certainly not before the upcoming parliamentary election. And I think what we'll certainly also see going forward is renewed questions about Germany's dependence on the United States when it comes to security and defense. German officials acknowledge that the Bundeswehr simply could not remain longer in Afghanistan once the U.S. decided to go, for logistical reasons, because it depends also on the U.S. for intelligence and more. The Chancellor is said to have told party colleagues this morning that the abrupt U.S. exit was driven by domestic political considerations in the U.S. But whether any of that will encourage Germany to act more independently in future, or rather reinforce this country's long-standing isolationist tendencies, that remains to be seen.
The elections, you just mentioned them. How important will this topic, Afghanistan, be in the upcoming elections, you think?
Well, of course, it's no surprise that much of the harshest criticism is coming from opposition voices. Obviously, that's partly driven by the election. Another thing that was driven by the election was the long dithering about whether to accept local staff as refugees here in Germany and under what conditions and what kind of bureaucratic procedures they needed to go through. All of that, of course, a discussion carried on by politicians with an eye to the fact that immigration is a hot potato during election season. I think, generally speaking, foreign policy doesn't tend to be determinative of election results. But this catastrophe certainly does implicate top leadership, for example, in the foreign ministry, and perhaps that could redound to some degree to their detriment going forward.
Melinda, Chancellor Merkel reportedly told party colleagues this morning, quote, "We will be dealing with this for a very long time to come." What does she have in mind there?
She has migration in mind. She is also said to have told the same party colleagues in the same meeting that Germany needed to do a great deal more to ensure that as many local staff as possible are extricated from Afghanistan and brought here. And she said Germany needs to do a great deal more to support Afghanistan's neighbors, Iran, Pakistan, and others, which, of course, they have taken in over years the vast majority of people fleeing Afghanistan. So what does support mean? Financial aid and more. And clearly the idea is that thereby one would hope to keep people in those countries, which is also part of international migration law, to try to keep people as close to the country of origin as possible. And again, a major challenge going forward.
Thank you very much. DW's chief political correspondent, Melinda Crane there. Thank you.
As the Taliban topple the Western-backed government in Afghanistan, European companies weigh up the economic cost. Many German companies are heavily invested in major infrastructure projects in Afghanistan. Among the multi-billion-euro deals now facing an uncertain future are Siemens Energy's electricity project, a collaboration with the old government in Kabul. Just 1/3 of Afghanistan's population have regular access to electricity. And a German government-backed airport project in Afghanistan's fourth largest city, Mazar-e-Sharif, is now in Taliban hands. And for more on the situation, I'm joined by Tilman Brück. He's the founder and director of ISDC, that's the International Security and Development Center here in Berlin. Good to have you with us. First of all, there are, of course, many European investors, many European companies, including Siemens, invested and active in Afghanistan. Given these dramatic developments, is business right now actually still an option?
No, I don't think it is. I think the Taliban, by their nature and by their ideology, are not interested in foreign investors, and they're not interested in economic growth. They have a different agenda, and they will actually relish to put themselves apart. But I think there's a second layer to this. There's the question, sort of from a moral point of view, also, whether foreign investors would want to cut deals with this regime, which will definitely reject Western values at their core.
But not investing in the country also means that you abandon the population there, the population that is right now at the mercy of the Taliban. And on top of it, they're now looking at economic loss.
Yes, I think we are seeing the international community at large, at least the Western international community at large, the ones who have been heavily involved militarily over the last 20 years, abandoning Afghanistan. I think that's what the images from the weekend and today from Kabul Airport show very clearly. The economy mostly was dependent on aid and drugs and maybe a little bit of agriculture. So I think the scope for private sector-led investment and growth was always very limited and is even more limited in the absence of Western allies on the ground.
Now, of course, this isn't the first government that's been toppled. We've seen other areas and regions where the government has fallen amongst either a military coup or Islamists, as in this case. Now, given that experience, what are the key indicators for the outside world, for foreign aid, for example, to determine whether this Taliban regime is trustworthy, as they claim to be?
Yes, I think one has to take all of their claims at the moment with a pinch of salt. Their past record is not good. Their current record is not good. If reports are to be believed from other parts of Afghanistan, where the Taliban have been in power a few more days, weeks, months, or years. So basically, they would need to commit to some basic package of, Western values or universal values, if you like. Now, Western governments do business and do give aid to countries where the human rights records are imperfect. But I think there's a minimum threshold that would have to be maintained, including the rights of women and girls. And I'm very skeptical that the current or the new incoming Taliban regime would stick to that.
All right, Tilman Brück, founder and director of the International Security and Development Center in Berlin. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.